In Chicago, USA, Deputy Chief Prosecutor Rusty is a man who seems to have a perfect life, successful career, happy marriage. He and his wife Barbara have a son and a daughter. It is impossible to associate him with a murder case. However, one afternoon Rusty received a phone call that made him confused and worried. He hurriedly left the scene. Outside, many police cars were parked. The crowd surrounded the crime scene, chatting excitedly. Chief Prosecutor Raymond sat outside and sighed. The moment Rusty stepped inside, his heart almost stopped beating. The victim was his colleague, Prosecutor Carolyn. She died very tragically. Her hands and feet were tied behind her back, and her whole body was covered with injuries. Because of Carolyn's status, the case was of special interest to the prosecutors. Many prosecutors competed to take this case, especially Tommy, who always confronted Rusty. Of course, the one who wanted to take the case the most was still Rusty. The reason is simple. Raymond is about to run for re-election, so if the case is not solved before the election, the opposing side will be able to replace him. At that time, the whole system will change. Rusty's position as Deputy Chief Prosecutor will also be replaced by Tommy. However, there is another reason why Rusty took this case that no one knows. The media quickly reported Carolyn's death. When Barbara watched the news, she did not show any shock or regret, but she carefully observed Rusty's expression to see how he reacted. Because Carolyn used to be Rusty's lover, the two maintained a secret relationship for a year. Although Rusty promptly broke off that relationship, this still caused a rift between him and Barbara. On the day of Carolyn's funeral, Rusty suddenly discovered that she had been married and had a son with her ex-husband. Carolyn had never mentioned this before. According to Carolyn's ex-husband, the two had been divorced for 9 years and had almost lost contact. Because of their broken marriage, their son's personality changed. He was quiet, rebellious, and autistic. The autopsy report showed that the fatal wound was caused by a blunt object hitting the victim's head. The police did not find a murder weapon, but based on the shape of the wound, it was likely a copper poker, the common type. There were many bloodstains on Carolyn's body. Her hands and feet were tied tightly, leaving deep marks, but there were no signs of stabbing or assault. What was suspicious was that Carolyn had worked on a case where the victim was murdered in a very similar way to her. Could it be that the murderer was taking revenge on her? But this theory was unreasonable, because the murderer, Liam, had been sent to prison by Carolyn. He had a perfect alibi. Colleague Lee repeatedly mentioned that the victim in the old case was stabbed in the heart, while Carolyn was hit in the head, and the two ways of death were different. But Rusty still insisted on going to prison to see Liam. Rusty suspected that Liam was using outside forces to take revenge on Carolyn. Liam still harbored resentment for the trial years ago, so he refused to reveal anything. Liam only left a sentence: "I will never forget the faces of those who harmed me." Rusty discovered small fibers on Carolyn's clothes and body from a carpet that was not in her apartment. There were no traces of ligatures when Carolyn was killed. The room showed no signs of a break-in. This indicated that she might have known the killer. The rope used for the blindfold was a thick rope 1 or 2 centimeters long. It was quite common. Other than that, there were no other clues. Carolyn was an excellent and very popular prosecutor, but she also had many enemies. Most people suspected that she was being revenged by the person she had tried. Not only did they pressure Rusty about the progress of the investigation, they also joined forces with the opposition to accuse Raymond of not fulfilling his responsibility to protect the safety of the people. Under the wave of public opinion, Raymond's approval rating dropped dramatically. On election day, the opposition successfully won the position of chief prosecutor. Of course, Rusty's position as deputy prosecutor was also replaced by Tommy. The enormous pressure made Rusty unable to breathe. He confided to his psychologist that his father had betrayed his mother and destroyed the whole family. Therefore, he swore that he would not repeat that mistake. Rusty fell in love with Barbara when he was 20 years old. They quickly got married and had 2 children. But married life was not as smooth as he thought. More and more troubles piled up. Although Rusty still loved Barbara, he always felt a void in his heart that could not be filled. And at that time, Carolyn, humorous and talented, appeared to fill that void. Many nights, Rusty used work as an excuse to cover up his relationship with Carolyn. After Rusty confessed, he felt much relieved, but he didn't expect that there would be more trouble ahead. The crime scene analysis showed that there were many of Rusty's fingerprints in the apartment, especially in the bedroom. Carolyn's phone call history also showed that the two had a private relationship outside of work. But the most shocking information was that Carolyn was 6 weeks pregnant when she died. Tommy immediately took advantage of this weakness and forced Rusty to do a DNA test. Raymond was angry because Rusty hid this relationship. Rusty became more and more confused. He kept imagining all the bad things that could happen. At this time, Rusty was forced to confess to Barbara that although he had broken up with Carolyn a year ago, they had gotten back together for about a week not long ago. The seemingly perfect man turned out to be a bad guy. On the surface, Rusty looked disoriented, but in reality Rusty, he was tied to Carolyn and couldn't escape. Rusty reviewed Liam's case file and discovered a serious mistake. The DNA sample collected from the victim was from another person besides Liam, but the documents provided to the defense did not mention this detail. This evidence could prove that Liam was not the only culprit. Why did Carolyn hide this? Rusty angrily scolded the forensic staff, but the report of the results was not their responsibility. Rusty had to stop, but this action was quickly reported to the opposition and to Tommy, who was also the new police chief of the government. Rusty returned home in a bad mood. Meanwhile, Rusty called his colleague Lee, but no one answered. Several days of stressful work exhausted him both physically and mentally. At that time, Barbara wanted Rusty to confess to his 2 children about his affair. Anyway, hearing it from Rusty's own mouth was better than rumors from society or the press. When Rusty explained the whole story, his image of a great father officially collapsed. This family was being oppressed by an invisible force. But not everyone's life was always smooth. The 3 words overcome sounded easy, but when worldview, emotions, and hopes all collapsed, rebuilding was very difficult. Rusty remembered what Carolyn had said, that she didn't want anyone to be hurt. But from the moment their relationship began, irreparable damage had been formed. Before dawn, the police had surrounded Rusty's house. When the search warrant was issued, he knew clearly what the next steps would be. Every corner of the house, every item was thoroughly searched. All the electronic equipment was confiscated. Even taking DNA samples in front of his family made Rusty feel extremely humiliated. Not only that, Rusty also became the #1 suspect in Carolyn's murder. The opposing side immediately suspended his case. The psychiatrist firmly believed that Rusty was lying because he deliberately hid the fact that he had gotten back together with Carolyn. Barbara took the initiative to speak up for Rusty before the doctor agreed to give him a psychological evaluation. Listening to Rusty recall the past with Carolyn, about how Carolyn had been crazy about him. Even Carolyn almost became his stalker. Barbara clenched her hands nervously. She felt the pain like a knife cutting into her heart. James's wife was Barbara's best friend. When James's wife met Rusty, she only kept a cold attitude. A week before Carolyn died, Rusty had sent her many emails. The cell phone also recorded a series of communications between the two, plus Rusty's fingerprints at the scene. Tommy certainly wouldn't ignore these details to confirm his suspicions. The most important thing now was to find someone who understood the legal process to defend Rusty. James was the best candidate, but James still held a grudge because Rusty had hidden an illicit relationship, so James didn't want to accept. Tommy was afraid of trouble, so he asked everyone related to Rusty to withdraw from the case, including Lee. But Lee still decided to help Rusty and arranged for him to meet Liam in prison. Without his status as deputy chief prosecutor, Rusty could no longer interrogate him in an official capacity, but only as a civil conversation. Liam was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Rusty wanted to make a deal. As long as Liam provided favorable clues, Rusty would find a way to help him reduce his sentence. Liam even had a chance to be released. Rusty used to be arrogant, but now he had to bow down and beg Liam. Liam saw through Rusty's situation. Liam not only did not help Rusty, but also mocked Rusty. Rusty was at a disadvantage and he no longer trusted him. The only person Rusty could rely on now was Lee, but the condition was that Rusty could not lie anymore. Raymond also began to reconsider Rusty's offer. Raymond's rival in Tommy had used despicable tricks to take his position. He just wanted revenge to vent his anger. Actually, Raymond could not let go of his friendship with Rusty. That night, the police once again surrounded Rusty's house. He was officially arrested. The rival faction immediately held a press conference to attack Rusty's criminal behavior. The media rushed to report the news. Most of them were waiting to see Rusty's shameful face, because for them, what they needed was a shocking case, not the truth. Raymond appeared as Rusty's defense lawyer. Raymond pleaded Rusty's innocence and bailed him out. In fact, neither of them had any evidence at the time that could prove Rusty's innocence. They had to race against time to find the point of suspicion as quickly as possible, because time is a key factor in litigation. But was Rusty really wronged? That night, Rusty received a text message. He was singing. The text message read, "I saw you." Rusty was clearly terrified when he read this line. It also made Rusty confess another secret to Barbara. The night of the crime, Rusty went to see Carolyn. Although Rusty insisted that the two were just arguing and not about murder, it still made others wonder if he was hiding something that he couldn't say. The media crowded around Rusty's house to get more information. The children were so scared that they didn't dare go out. Barbara had to wear sunglasses when she went to work, but she was still surrounded by reporters in front of her company's door. Her boss was worried that this would affect the company, so he fired her without hesitation. When Barbara was most disappointed, she met a man named Kubo when she went out drinking. He was humorous and attentive, like a light shining into Barbara's dark life. James's wife wanted to advise Barbara to take revenge to relieve her mood, but she still felt regretful and couldn't bear to see Rusty, so she refused his advice. Tommy knew that Lee Lee was secretly helping Rusty, so he threatened to force Lee to stop. But Lee, who was an upright person, was not afraid of a deputy prosecutor who had been in office for 2 weeks. Because if she dared to fire a veteran employee, the union would strongly oppose it. Lee scolded his opponent and Tommy and left. But before leaving, he remembered something. He immediately asked his colleagues to go to the forensic office to reinvestigate the files related to Liam's case. After a day of internal struggle, Rusty decided to go to an abandoned factory where he had sent the message to Anne. What Rusty did not expect was that this person was Michael, Carolyn's son. Since his parents' divorce, Michael often hung around his mother's house. Perhaps he still longed for maternal love. On the night of the crime, he saw with his own eyes that only Rusty went to Carolyn's house. He took photos and videos and handed them all over to the police. Raymond invited veteran lawyer Meyer to attend the progress report meeting organized by the opponent. The only condition was that Rusty could not say anything. The opponent accused Raymond of obstructing justice because he acted as Rusty's defense attorney without authorization. Rusty panicked so much that he forgot his instructions. Rusty loudly denounced his opponent and Tommy for using dirty tricks. Rusty said that the charges against him were all fabricated. At this time, the judge had to step in to stop the argument and declare that this trial would be based only on evidence and the law. No one would be allowed to give a damn. The charges against Raymond were immediately dismissed. Raymond took the opportunity to ask the opponent to provide all the evidence, including the video and photos that Michael took near Carolyn's house. Tommy's eyes wavered. It was obvious that Tommy deliberately hid the evidence to create a surprise in the trial to defeat Rusty. Unexpectedly, Raymond exposed him. Tommy was forced to hand over all the documents. The judge also warned Tommy that if he continued to do anything shady, he would be playing with fire and burning himself to death. Rusty and his family announced the progress of the case, but the current situation was still very unfavorable for him. He suddenly spoke up and advised him to consider a plea deal. If Tommy proves Rusty's guilt, he will be sentenced to life in prison. But if Rusty pleads guilty and successfully negotiates, the manslaughter charge will only carry an 8-year sentence. That means Rusty will have to admit he is the murderer. Despair and helplessness well up in his heart. Does his son not believe he is innocent? Actually, his son has not lost faith in him. His son is just worried that with the current situation, he will be wrongly accused and imprisoned. His son does not want to spend the rest of his life in a cold prison cell. Before the hearing, Mia asked Rusty if his feelings for Carolyn were love or just lust. He instinctively wanted to avoid the question, but under Mia's persistence, Rusty admitted that it was both. This feeling was born from the first time they worked together on a case. Carolyn showed special kindness and patience with the victim. It was that moment that made Rusty cross the line. From then on, he completely ruined his life. Raymond took Rusty back to the crime scene. Every item in the apartment seemed to have memories that reminded him of every sweet moment between the two. Next was the horrifying image of Carolyn's brutal death. As agreed, Tommy sent Rusty all the videos and pictures that Michael had taken. The images were a bit blurry, but the surrounding scenery was still recognizable. As he flipped through each photo, he suddenly recognized a very familiar figure. It was his son, Kai. Why was Kai at the scene? With Barbara by his side, Kai stammered that he just happened to be riding his bike by accident. But Kai could not fool someone who had investigated many cases like Rusty. In the end, Kai was forced to admit that he had known about Carolyn and Rusty for a long time. Rusty asked Kai why he had come there. While talking, he couldn't control his emotions. Barbara was worried that Kai would be hurt, so she interrupted the tense conversation. It was clear that Kai had gradually gotten involved in the case. He was more or less involved in it. Barbara was worried about Kai's mental state. At the same time, Barbara was also angry with Rusty's attitude. The two argued fiercely. Rusty complained to Raymond that Barbara would leave him sooner or later. But if she really wanted to leave, why wait until now? Wasn't it stupid to wait for a traitor to turn around? Rusty's current dissatisfaction was just a way to reduce his guilt. The type of person who wants to do wrong but still wants to maintain a good image. After making a mistake, a person often has two emotions: shame and guilt. Shame is a feeling that comes from oneself. Guilt is the feeling of pain that one has caused others. Obviously, Rusty is the first type. Tommy is determined to win. He asks the forensics to practice testifying. He even teaches them how to speak persuasively. At the same time, Tommy contacts Carolyn's son, Michael, and gets a key clue. Carolyn once said that she was very afraid of a certain colleague, but no matter how Michael asks, Carolyn refuses to reveal that person's identity. Lee, the only colleague who still helps Rusty, is still investigating the DNA results in Liam's case. The owner of the DNA sample that Carolyn deliberately concealed is Brian, who lives in a normal family of 3. Rusty frankly asks about Brian's alibi for the night of Liam's murder. Brian is clearly a little panicked. His voice trembles, and he refuses to answer any questions. Then he chases them away. That night, Rusty has a nightmare. He sees himself holding a brass poker and walking towards Carolyn. When Rusty woke up, Barbara was no longer lying next to him. She was busy scrubbing her son's bite. She wanted to hide the fact that her son had ever been near Carolyn's house. Their son was uncooperative during therapy. He refused to answer any questions. This behavior made the therapist realize that the problem was much more serious than they thought. Rusty revealed to Maya that the night Carolyn was murdered, he sent many text messages but received no response. It wasn't until 9:24 p.m., while he was drinking at the bar, that Carolyn texted back, agreeing to meet. Michael took a photo showing Rusty arriving at Carolyn's house at 9:49 p.m. Rusty thought Carolyn wanted to reconnect, but it was all his imagination. The two had a fierce argument. The police investigation report stated that Rusty arrived home at 11 p.m. Carolyn's house was 20 minutes away from Rusty's. That meant Rusty left at 10:40, and he had been at Carolyn's house for 51 minutes. If it was just a quarrel, that was too long. Lee continued to investigate Brian, but unfortunately, he had no criminal record and had not found any suspicious points. Meanwhile, Raymond attended the meeting with the opposing side. Raymond declared that he would not let Rusty accept a plea deal because there was no blood from Carolyn on Rusty's person, car, or clothes. The fact that Carolyn was hyped up like that showed that the killer had prepared in advance. But hitting her head with a brass rod seemed like a rash act. The case had been a mess from the start. The opposing side and Tommy had been pressuring Rusty out of personal enmity. Finding out the truth, giving Rusty justice, and ending their careers would be the best revenge. However, the opposing side was not confident enough to take out a file. Raymond was shocked as soon as he saw it. Under Carolyn's bed, he found Rusty's skin sample. He kept insisting that he was being set up. Just then, there was a knock on the door. It was Brian, whom Rusty had been investigating. Rusty was already extremely angry. Brian provoked him further. Rusty couldn't help but beat Brian up. The next morning, Rusty wanted to find Brian to talk things out, but he was on high alert. Brian almost hit Rusty in the head with a wrench. News of the assault and home invasion quickly reached Raymond. Rusty still insisted that it was enough to prove that Carolyn had deliberately concealed the truth about Liam's case. If there was a second suspect, Brian, then it could be proven that Brian and Liam were accomplices. From there, successfully diverting suspicion from Rusty saved his life from complete collapse. Raymond agreed. Raymond summoned Brian to investigate, but Brian insisted that he was not at the scene at the time of the crime. Brian insisted that he did not know Liam. This denied all of Rusty's previous speculations. That night was extremely long. Not only Rusty but everyone else was awake and could not sleep because the next day was the official trial. Reporters surrounded both Rusty's house and the courthouse gate. All eyes were waiting for the results of this trial. After a brief introduction, Tommy showed a photo of Carolyn when she was alive. A bright, optimistic female prosecutor, but tortured beyond recognition. The murderer not only ruined Carolyn's life, but also caused her son and those who loved her to suffer to the same extent. Persons' motives are always hidden in their hearts. Everyone must try to think to understand what happened. If the truth cannot be found, what hope is there for justice? Carolyn had taken that belief into the prosecution profession when she was alive. Tommy's words were designed to evoke sympathy from the jury, but a person's reason, when overwhelmed by emotion, will no longer make accurate judgments. And this was clearly what Tommy wanted. His opening was convincing. His spirit, thoughts, and unwavering belief created reasonable doubt in the trial. The first witness called was the coroner. He presented the results of the autopsy. Carolyn had been hit 3 times in the head with a charcoal stick, resulting in a laceration of the scalp, severe hematoma, and skull fracture. She died from massive blood loss. The time of death was between 10 p.m. and midnight. There were no obvious defensive wounds. Rusty's tissue was found in her fingernails. It could have been an accidental overdose while trying to defend herself. Carolyn was 6 weeks pregnant at the time of her death. Tests confirmed that Rusty was the father. In addition, the coroner said that Rusty had shown strong emotions in front of him, as if Rusty was afraid of being discovered. This made him suspicious, but Raymond immediately refuted and said that the coroner and Rusty had never liked each other before. So he did not do a psychological evaluation based on science, but took advantage of the opportunity to appear in court to express his personal prejudice. Raymond's words hit the bull's eye, making the coroner even more nervous. When Raymond repeatedly questioned him, he even sarcastically said that Raymond deserved not being re-elected. Even though the judge gavelled a warning, he could not stop his anger. This chaotic performance made the prosecution's accusations against Rusty less convincing. The trial had just begun, but Tommy and the opposing side had already suffered a heavy blow. The next witness was Barbara, Rusty's wife. Raymond asked the couple to show an image of unity and overcoming difficulties. Barbara needed to show that she trusted and loved Rusty deeply in order to win the sympathy of the jury. But a woman who had been betrayed and now had to accompany her husband in a murder trial was extremely difficult. Other than being surprised, what attitude could she show? If she was now forced to declare absolute belief in innocence, the jury would not not be stupid enough to not recognize the hypocrisy. So Barbara decided to present herself as honestly as possible. Only by making others feel trustworthy would her defense stand. In the second trial, another experienced forensic expert was summoned. He said that in addition to the skin cells under the fingernails, he also found traces of saliva that matched Rusty's DNA on Carolyn's face and collar. The strange thing was that the crime scene was very bloody and chaotic, but there was almost no trace that the killer had tried to erase the traces to hide the crime. With 20 years of experience, the forensic doctor believed that the killer was someone who had suddenly killed Carolyn in a fit of anger. Then the killer hastily tied her up. Raymond quickly discovered the loophole. The skin cells in Carolyn's fingernails were not skin cells, but just epidermal cells. A light touch on the cheek could also leave this type of cell. It could not be ruled out that this was the result of intimacy. The same was true of the saliva traces on Carolyn's body. All of this could not prove that Rusty was the killer who murdered Carolyn. The next witness was Rusty's former assistant. This person had witnessed Rusty and Carolyn being intimate in the office. Then the person saw them arguing in the basement. Rusty was so infatuated with Carolyn that he almost became a harasser. But Carolyn never complained to HR about Rusty. Instead, she had complained about another coworker, Tommy. The whole room started to stir. Many people looked at Tommy strangely, especially when the witness said that Carolyn felt that Tommy made her uncomfortable. The public began to question whether Tommy had ever harassed Carolyn. The trial started to tip the scales in many people's minds. Tommy and his opponents were worried. The situation was not going as they expected. Rusty saw a rare ray of hope. His daughter suddenly brought up a topic in psychology class about trauma and dissociation. That is, when a person does something unacceptable or inconsistent with their self-image, the brain will automatically activate the defense mechanism and separate their memories. This dissociation phenomenon makes them unable to remember the sequence of events, even their psychological reactions and thoughts. But what does she mean by that? Does she think Rusty is avoiding the truth? Barbara also confessed to Rusty the truth that during the time Rusty was tormented by psychological pressure, she once again went to the bar. Talking with Kubo helped her temporarily forget the troubles of the past. She suppressed her emotions and could not speak out. Kubo understood her confusion, so he took the initiative to leave his contact number. After much hesitation, Barbara finally called him. The two of them had a date at Kubo's apartment. The dim lights made people lose control easily. When hormones were stimulated, all reason was thrown to the back of their minds. But Barbara still maintained her limits. She told the psychiatrist that the evening was very romantic, but she didn't feel ashamed of being a little ambiguous with another man since Rusty betrayed her. Barbara often doubted herself whether she was beautiful enough or attractive enough. Loving someone is like that. Only because of their mistakes, you put yourself in a spiral of emotions and doubt yourself. So when she discovered that someone was pursuing her, she even felt relieved. It turned out that the fault was not hers. Barbara's frank confession completely confused Rusty. He didn't know how to react. He walked around the room without saying a word, but it was clear that he was extremely upset. It turned out that being betrayed by someone you love could make people so angry. At this moment, Rusty finally understood what it meant to be a double-edged sword. It was just that Barbara had chosen this moment to confess, which was too coincidental, while he was lying about the case. This did not make him appreciate his wife's honesty, but instead, his fatherly feelings arose. The two had a big argument. Rusty was so angry that he hugged his head. That night, neither of them could sleep. Who would have thought that the course of the case would take a sudden turn and was about to spiral out of control? This trial would reveal the love messages between Rusty and Carolyn from their phones and computers. On the day Carolyn was murdered, Rusty sent her more than 30 messages. Barbara could not bear it, so she asked Raymond's wife to accompany her to court. According to the current situation, even if Rusty was convicted, the most he could do was second-degree murder. The judge recommended that both sides agree to a plea bargain for involuntary manslaughter, but neither Tommy nor Rusty agreed. One side was determined to put the other in prison for life. The other side was determined to get an acquittal and an apology. No one would back down. The case had to continue. The next witness to be called was Carolyn's son, Michael. He often went to his mother's house to observe and took a picture of Rusty meeting his mother at 9:49 p.m. the night of the murder. Michael then texted Rusty to meet him, simply to look straight into the eyes of the man he thought was the murderer. 2 weeks before the murder, Carolyn had told Michael that she had a conflict with a man in the company. Although she did not say his name, he guessed that it was Rusty. Raymond intended to stand up and ask a few questions, but for some reason, he felt uncomfortable as soon as he moved and fainted in front of everyone's astonished eyes. Fortunately, he was rescued in time. After a few hours, Raymond was out of danger and had a pacemaker fitted. The doctor said he was doing better after the surgery. This incident caused a lot of trouble for the opposing side and Tommy, because because when Raymond fainted, everyone saw Rusty rushing to save him regardless. This brave act would certainly help Rusty score points with the jury. It might even make them inclined to declare him innocent. But Rusty was not relieved at all. Losing an excellent defense attorney like Raymond greatly reduced Rusty's chances of winning. The opposing side, under the pretext of ensuring that the proceedings were not affected by inappropriate prejudice and bias, asked the judge to declare the trial void. That meant that all previous evidence would be invalidated. All of Rusty's efforts would be in vain. But Rusty asked for the trial to continue and asked to take on the role of lead lawyer. Maya was the assistant lawyer. The opponents knew Rusty had a lot of experience, so they immediately pointed out that he was currently a defendant, so he could not defend himself. The two sides continued to argue. The judge finally decided that Rusty could still serve as defense attorney, but he also had to sit in the witness chair, using the form of cross-examination to participate in the litigation. It was raining heavily that day. Rusty walked into the courthouse with Barbara on his arm. The trial continued from where Raymond collapsed the day before. Michael was called to the witness chair again. Rusty presented a series of text messages between Michael and Carolyn in the last few weeks of Carolyn's life. Michael sent many hateful messages, mostly cursing his mother. He said she had ruined his relationship with his father and even wished she would disappear. Michael had watched outside Carolyn's house for many days, so he knew early on about the relationship between Rusty and her. When Rusty asked if Michael had told his father what he had seen after returning home, Michael hesitated and said he didn't remember. Michael's reaction made Rusty find a weakness. In a fit of rage that night, Michael told his father that he had seen Carolyn meeting her lover. Michael's computer stored many documents related to the cases that Carolyn had handled. Michael often visited real crime websites to gather information. Michael even researched Liam's case. This showed that Michael had a certain understanding of the crime method and the details related to the denial of the victim. So were Michael and his father suspects in Carolyn's murder? This was something that the opposing side and Tommy clearly knew, but they did not dare to investigate further. Rusty's sharp accusations aimed directly at Michael and his father. At the same time, they put a lot of pressure on the opposing side. The next trial, Tommy's side called Rusty's colleague Lee to testify and played the recording between Rusty and Liam in prison. Rusty had used the offer of a reduced sentence to lure Liam into giving clues or even confessing to Carolyn's murder. His reckless attitude shocked the jury and Raymond, who was watching the trial live. Lee was not present at the scene, so she did not know the whole story, but she honestly stated that Rusty requested that all investigative documents be sent to him first. Absolutely not let the opposing side and Tommy know. But during the investigation, it was not unusual for the prosecution to request confidentiality. Rusty believed that he was wronged, so he did everything to prove his innocence. Rusty did not like Tommy, and he did not believe that Tommy would investigate fairly, so it was reasonable for him to make such a request. Rusty's argument made Tommy panic because according to the rules, the defendant cannot plead innocent in court. All of his questions and rebuttals just now went beyond the scope of direct questioning, leaving him with only two options. One is to request a dismissal of the trial. The other is to sit in the witness chair. After a fierce psychological struggle, Rusty chose the second option. This meant that Rusty would become the target of Tommy's full-force attack. Mia lost faith in the case, so she no longer took on the role of assistant lawyer. Rusty fell into a lonely situation again. He was a defendant, a lawyer, and a witness, under all kinds of pressure. How would Rusty face it? Would there be any miracles? Luckily, Mia still called Rusty to remind him not to let Tommy anger him and respond in a way that would give the jury a negative view. The first thing James did after being discharged from the hospital was to continue taking on Rusty's case. After taking the solemn oath, Tommy continued to question Rusty. He tried to find signs of lying. He also revealed the messages Rusty sent to Carolyn before she was killed. More than 30 messages to prove how much Rusty was in love with her. Passion is a dangerous poison. No one is immune. But Rusty, who came to his senses after all, he realized that his wife and daughter were where he belonged. Rusty admitted that he was irrational at that time. But Rusty insisted that he had absolutely no intention of harming Carolyn because he was not a violent person. However, Tommy summoned another witness, Brienne. Then he showed the video of Rusty beating Brienne. Rusty calmly explained that it was because Brienne broke into his house. To protect his family, he was forced to react urgently. As for the reason for attacking the forensic doctor, it was because he discovered that Liam's case was being covered up, so he argued with the forensic doctor. It was all a reasonable action. No matter how Rusty tried to explain, Tommy still wouldn't let go of his weakness of being easily out of control. In this trial, Rusty was at a disadvantage, and Tommy began to taste a little bit of victory. When he returned home, the tightly closed window in his office was suddenly opened by someone. The room was ransacked in a chaotic mess. On the table was a copper poker. On top of it was a piece of paper with the words, "Go Joe died. The police quickly went to the scene to collect evidence. The fingerprints on the poker were deliberately blurred. However, Rusty could still confirm from the dent on the poker that it was the one that was in Carolyn's house. But there was no direct evidence. Rusty's word alone was not enough to accuse others or clear his name. The poker appeared in Tommy's house. That could have made him a suspect in hiding the murder weapon, and the threatening note made it even easier for the jury to see it as a warning from the killer. So both sides agreed to not mention the stick in court. At the final hearing, court summoned an expert to examine the evidence. He presented a receipt showing that at 8:55 that evening, an order of wonton noodles had been delivered to Carolyn's house. It takes at least 4 hours for the stomach to empty after eating, but the expert, after performing the autopsy, found that Carolyn's stomach was completely empty. This refuted the initial conclusion of the forensic pathologist that the time of death was not 10 p.m. but between 1 o'clock and 3 a.m. In Carolyn's kitchen, there was a half-empty container of Chinese food. Traces of food were found in the duodenum, but it could not be proven that it was the 8:55 delivery. Tommy argued that no one or medical method could determine whether Carolyn had eaten the delivery that night. Therefore, it was impossible to overturn the previous forensic conclusion. Raymond decided to find a new breakthrough. If only someone could prove that Rusty was elsewhere when Carolyn was murdered, things would be much simpler. Barbara immediately volunteered to be a witness, but she was opposed. Because she was too close to Rusty, it would make the jury suspect that she was biased. That could backfire at trial. The only solution left was to let Rusty make his closing statement. He stayed up all night in the barn, practicing what he wanted to say to the jury. His daughter, Celeste, came in, looking worried. She gave him a tight hug. There were things Rusty seemed to not dare to say to his family. He once again entered the courtroom and had to confess in front of them that he had betrayed his family, betrayed the person who loved him the most. This kind of hurt could not be repaired. Rusty admitted that he had an affair with Carolyn and that there were many of his fingerprints at the crime scene, but the police did not find any blood from the crime scene in the house. There were no eyewitnesses in his car or on his clothes. Rusty only learned that Carolyn was pregnant with Rusty after she died. He had no motive to kill her, and even less direct evidence to convict her. Tommy's constant targeting of Rusty finally had an explanation. Tommy had special feelings for Carolyn. Because of personal resentment or infatuation, Tommy refused to investigate other suspects and insisted on blaming Rusty. In 15 years as a prosecutor, Rusty had never prosecuted anyone without physical evidence, a murder weapon, witnesses, or forensic confirmation, but the opposing side did. If resentment was directed at an innocent person under unfair conditions, what was the point of holding a trial? Was it worthy of those who were wrongly imprisoned, or worthy of the victim? Rusty's appearance was no longer as certain as before, but he still tried to transform himself into an investigator for 48 hours, the most important time after the murder. Tommy thought Rusty had withheld information and hindered the investigation. This behavior was not like that of an innocent person, and certainly not like that of someone responsible for catching the murderer. Rusty said he was innocent, but according to Tommy, that was just a sophistry. If Rusty escaped punishment of the law, it would be heartbreaking for the victims and their families. The waiting period was the most severe trial. That night, everyone was awake. Tommy didn't even go home, but was on duty at the office. Early the next morning, they were all prepared. Even though they didn't know what the outcome would be, they had to face it in the best condition. Raymond and Rusty stood up to listen to the court clerk announce the verdict. The Supreme Court indicted Rusty. The jury unanimously found Rusty not guilty of murder. But you thought it was all over. If Rusty was innocent, who really killed Carolyn? Rusty was not relieved. That night, Rusty went to Barbara to ask for an explanation. He asked if she was the one who killed Carolyn, because the night of the murder, Rusty had returned to Carolyn's house. He collapsed in a pool of blood. The only obvious suspect was Barbara, who knew about the affair and harbored a grudge. Rusty remembered that Liam's case also involved a similar scene. Someone had deliberately recreated the scene to blame Liam, then shifted suspicion to Brian and Michael and his father. Rusty had tried to defend himself in court, not to save himself, but to protect a broken family. Then Rusty secretly installed a tracking device on Barbara's car. He discovered that she had been to Tommy's house. From then on, he believed that she had brought the stick to frame him. But at this moment, Celeste suddenly walked in and interrupted the conversation. What Rusty had just said was roughly correct, but there was one point that was wrong. The killer was not Barbara, but Celeste. She was the one who drove her mother's car to their house and left the stick. It turns out that it's not just the two adults who want to protect this family. Celeste has known about Carolyn and Rusty's affair for a long time. Celeste tried to convince Carolyn to back off, but Celeste learned that Carolyn was pregnant. In a fit of rage, Celeste took the stick from the repair shop and committed the unforgivable sin. Celeste cleaned the car and hid the stick. Celeste thought she could hide it forever. Even though Rusty now wants to take the blame for Celeste, she still wonders if he deserves deserves forgiveness. Can this family return to the happy times of the past? In the film, Celeste once told Rusty about the mechanism of trauma and dissociation. At first, it was thought that she was trying to convince him that he had committed a crime, but couldn't remember because he was too shocked. The purpose was to get him to take the blame for her, but her words could indicate that she herself had completely forgotten that memory. She didn't want to suffer the consequences to make it easier for Rusty to shift the suspicion to someone else, but she didn't want her family to be hurt. That's the end of the movie. Thank you, and see you again.